So yes, like was just mentioned, my name is Veronica Harradence, and my topic today is unconscious bias in tech. So a little bit about myself and my journey into tech so far. So I have a degree in history and politics, so nothing related to tech at all. And a lot of my background in work has been working with the NHS and sort of the care system. And then I moved to Manchester about 4 or 5 years ago and got involved with the tech community here. And sort of fell in love with tech and discovered my interest for moving into a career in tech. And from there, I found North Coders. So for you that don't know, North Coders is a intensive bootcamp for essentially learning to become a software developer. And from that, I got my first job as a junior software developer at a legal tech startup called Surmise, based here in Manchester. And I've just started a role at the Co-op as a junior intelligent process automation developer. So what is unconscious bias? So unconscious bias, or some call it implicit bias, is often defined as prejudice or unsupported judgments in favour of or against one thing, person, group as compared to another in a way that is usually considered unfair. So in contrast to that, deliberate prejudices are defined as conscious bias or explicit bias. So why am I interested in this topic? Why am I interested in unconscious bias as a junior developer? And the term unconscious bias, I first came across this issue when I read about the controversial Amazon recognition, the facial recognition technology, which I'm going to briefly discuss in a few slides' time. Recently as well, I've seen a lot more being discussed in the media at the moment on unconscious bias training. But I also felt as a developer, it's my responsibility as someone who builds software for people to consider unconscious bias in my own work and in other people's work. But mostly it's a topic that I'm interested in. So I hope you find something to take away from this, today's discussion. So after understanding what unconscious bias is, many organisations claim that unconscious bias in the workplace can impact our recruitment decisions, employee development, impairing diversity and retention rates, as well as promoting a disconnected culture. So something that is being brought in to address these possible issues is unconscious or implicit bias training. And these programs are designed to expose people to their implicit biases, essentially, and provide tools to adjust automatic patterns of thinking and ultimately eliminate discriminatory behaviours. So with that being said, recently the BBC have addressed similar issues and decided to start unconscious bias training themselves. At the same time as this, unconscious bias training is actually being scrapped in the government for ministers and civil servants. And the government say this is reason for there is no evidence to prove it helps to change attitudes. However, race equality campaigners declare that the government mustn't backtrack on anti-racism training and should replace their training with something else. And another company that has been in the media in relation to unconscious bias training that you may have seen is KPMG, whose boss, Bill Michael, resigned recently after they received complaints that he stated that unconscious bias training is crap. There is no such thing as unconscious bias, he said. I don't buy it, because after every single unconscious bias training that has ever been done, nothing's ever improved. So it's interesting to understand how different companies are deciding different things and on different points of their journey in addressing bias within their company and in tech. Another way unconscious bias could be within the tech industry is through our data. And I spoke to a data scientist recently from Intechnica, who are a tech company based in Manchester, about this issue. And we discussed this issue, well, he discussed this issue around ground truth. Can there ever be that ground truth of data? And could there ever be a source of validated set of data that we could compare our data to see whether it's biased or not? And even if this was possible, how does the person testing these biases address their own biases? And how could you legislate that? I gathered from his perspective and in our chat that there's no clear answer, but acknowledging, he states as a very experienced data scientist, that acknowledging and discussing these issues of bias in data is important to helping maybe start to become, for there to eventually come a ground truth. He also actually pointed out the interesting question about time and money. Do companies have the time and money to address these issues, even if they have the desire to want to overcome these? And all of these decisions, again, do depend on what your company and organization do and whether your data is being used to directly impact people's lives. One way data scientists are trying to overcome these biases that they notice in their data is through survivorship bias, and which is essentially whether you're realizing that you're looking for data will benefit the outcome of your own product. Something else they are looking into is something called sample bias, and where they say that some members of the public are more susceptible to being sampled, and what access do people have to being sampled? Is this prejudice and is this bias? Some ways they are overcoming this are oversampling, so sampling a greater set of people, and trying to make sampling more accessible. So, for example, if they are collecting data that is online, is their data only from people that have access to Wi-Fi? There's a lot of discussion and direct action being done to target bias in the collection data, as we mentioned. And one organization, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, claimed to be targeting one big organization on this exact thing. And they reviewed the Amazon facial recognition and claimed that when using their software, 27 professional athletes were falsely matched to mugshots in a criminal database. And this piece of software is widely used in organizations and in law enforcement. So MIT say facial recognition tools are trained on huge data sets of hundreds of thousands of images, but there is concern that many of these data sets are not sufficiently diverse to enable the algorithms to learn to correctly identify non-white faces. And I think it's important to say, to be fair to Amazon, they say this particular study was using 80% similarity threshold, whilst Amazon recommend that law enforcement use 99% certainty of match, so 99% threshold. However, research done by MIT, again, discovered it's harder to identify women and those of darker skinned faces. It misclassified women as men 19% of the time, the researchers said, and mistook darker skinned women for men 31% of the time. So someone that is trying to understand these issues around data and technology bias, as just discussed, is Hannah Fry. So she is a professor of mathematics, author, public speaker, the list goes on, She's written rather, a really good book called Hello World, How to Be Human in the Age of the Machine. And she says here, do we dismiss any mathematical system with built-in biases or proven capability in errors? And she makes the interesting point in this book that no known error state in blood spatter patterning and fingerprint detection, but proven when not fully relied on to be helpful. So she says there that although widely not criticised, although fingerprinting detection is widely not criticised, it is still being used and relied on alongside other technology. And she makes the debate, going back to the Amazon facial recognition, if not fully relied on, can it still be useful? So does it need to be 100% reliable? She again makes the argument, however, for when it is used for someone's freedom, such as in law enforcement, then it shouldn't be used. And asks the question whether there needs to be more regulation in the technology used in the criminal system. An organisation that came to a similar conclusion as what Hannah Fry just stated there was IBM, who last year abandoned their use of their own facial recognition software. They said they could not get, as I mentioned earlier, this source of ground truth for the data they were using. And the quote that they say here, artificial intelligence is a powerful tool that can help law enforcement keep citizens safe. But vendors and users of AI systems have a shared responsibility to ensure that AI is tested for bias, particularly when used in law enforcement, and that such bias testing is audited and reported. So something that follows on from bias in data is the discussion around possible bias in how we build our software. And one topic that has been addressed is language bias. So the term biased language refers to words and phrases that are considered prejudiced, offensive and hurtful. Biased language includes expressions that demean or exclude people because of age, sex, race, ethnicity, social class, or physical or mental traits. And a piece of software called BERT, so bidirectional encoder representations from transformers, is essentially optimized in capturing statistical properties of training data. So it's used to predict missing words in text and is often used by Google. And it learns from context and words around it. And because of this, it picks up on bias, it picks up on human bias and continues to learn from this bias like we do as humans. Studies like Carnegie University discovered that it recognizes and favors male pronouns more than women. Why does this matter in real life and in practice? Why does this bias matter in our industry? And one reason is, if we take the above example, is that it is used for job recommendations on social media platforms, where most social media platforms ask for your gender. And jobs that are stereotypically more male role with higher salaries are favoured in recommendations to men on social media. So after all this discussion about where there is evidence of racial, language, gender bias in tech, in our software and possibly in our workplace, I was, and I guess I am, still left wondering what to do with all this information and how we should make practical steps in eradicating some, and if not all, unconscious bias in our production of AI, collection of data, and within our own workplace communities. And someone who I think is super interesting to listen to on answering this question is Kimberly Bryant. So she's the founder and executive director of Black Girls Code, and they state that they're a non-profit organisation dedicated to changing the face of technology by introducing girls of colour ages 7 to 17 to the field of technology and computer science. So she's spent 25 plus years in the biotech and pharmaceutical industry as an engineering manager. And I would say if you're interested in anything that I've mentioned today, just Google her name, there's loads online. She's had some really interesting talks and discussions and interviews. But she says this quote here: focus on bringing people in from the demographic instead of just utilizing them as consumers. And I think that's a really powerful statement and question, really. And she asked companies and ourselves to consider how much your workplace will benefit from reflecting the demographic of your community, and says if you want to reach your demographic, then you need to represent them in your company. And she addresses the idea that of the importance in acknowledging bias, and that is most of the struggle in solving it. And she often quotes, fortunately for serious minds, a bias recognized is a bias sterilized. And I'll leave you on this last quote from AI Ethics and Practice report that suggests that diverse teams work on AI in order to stop potential issues surrounding the way it's used. Diverse teams are more likely to spot problems in data and challenge assumptions that could lead to unfair bias being programmed in AI. So thank you very much for listening.